Then I think I can start now with the pleasant part of the meeting, namely to introduce Rachel. Rachel Nordlinger is a professor. Let me see what her official title is. Professor of linguistics and also the director of the research unit for indigenous languages at the University of Melbourne. She is a very famous linguist. We are very, very pleased to have her. We're very, very proud to have secured her. She is well known for her work on Australian languages. She has worked on a number of different Australian languages, very much also in the description part and the documentation part. And there's many ongoing projects, and we will hear about this later on today. With a new element, actually, on language acquisition, which is really exciting. But the other real important area of Rachel's work is her work on formal syntax, semantics, and morphology, in particular also in the framework of lexical functional grammar, LFG. And I came first across her work for something very, very exciting, which was, I think it was called constructive case, and involved a notion of functional uncertainty. And I really like that because it means you could do something without really saying what you're doing. So everybody who has like commitment issues, this was a really useful formal apparatus to encode that. So I was very excited about it. And I think that's in the LFG community, and indeed beyond the LFG community and wider syntactic framework, that's still a very powerful tool, which many people use for modeling all kinds of things where essentially, so we use that for word order uncertainty, but I think there's other parts as well. So that's really nice. It's a shame that Rachel is not with us in person, because she's also a very, very social person. We met last in the summer at the Syntax of the World's Languages conference in Potsdam, which was very jolly. But nevertheless, we are very pleased, Rachel, that you can join us online and we make use of the technology. The talk title today is Acquiring Polysynthesis, How Children Learn Murrinhpatha, a language from Northern Australia. And I'm very pleased, Rachel, to give the floor to you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lutz. And I am also sorry that I can't be there with you all. It would be much more fun, I'm sure, but maybe, a bit harder on my liver, perhaps. But yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you for the Society and Kirsty for the invitation to present to you all tonight, or I guess it's morning for you all, night for me. And thank you to Lutz for the introduction. And thank you for being willing to meet at an unusual time, so that it's only 10 o'clock at night for me and not 4 in the morning or something, which might have been a lot harder. Okay, so as I'm sure many people, or perhaps all of you, are aware, the world's 7,000 odd languages are extraordinarily diverse in many interesting ways. But this diversity is being lost at a really alarming rate. And this is a problem for all sorts of reasons. Of course, for the communities themselves that are losing or are struggling to continue to maintain their languages. But it's also a huge loss potentially for us as scientists, because very little of this diversity has yet to be incorporated into all of our theories of language. So estimates are that approximately 40% of the world's languages are substantially undocumented still. And this is even more striking in the first language acquisition research area, where a recent study estimates that, or it's actually based on an analysis of journals in the field over the last 45 years. And what they find is that only 1.5% of the world's languages are represented in this literature. Most of these 1.5% are Indo-European languages. And for those that are not, the non-Indo-European languages are mostly represented with just one single paper on one single phenomenon. And what this means, as Passmore and others point out in a recent paper, this means that due to sampling biases, very little is known about how children learn much of the vast corners of the linguistic design space. And our opportunity to actually discover this is very quickly running out. So today I'm going to talk about some work that myself and colleagues have been doing for a number of years on acquisition of Murrinhpatha. This is a polysynthetic language from Northern Australia, and I am aware that it's potentially a a broad audience here, so I'll talk a little bit about what I mean by polysynthetic in a moment. It's got verbal morphology that's very, very complex and typologically unusual. And fortunately, it is still being learned by children as a first language. So it gives us a really rare opportunity to study the processes by which children acquire this sort of complex verbal morphology. And very little is known about this. Both polysynthetic languages and Australian Indigenous languages in general are greatly underrepresented, almost non-existent in the language acquisition literature. And so, doing this work is making, I think, a very important contribution to our understanding of how children acquire diverse structures. But before I get into all of this, since I assume I'm speaking with a completely non-Australian audience or largely non-Australian audience, I thought I'd just briefly introduce you to Australian languages more generally for people who maybe are not familiar with them. So Australia itself is a very diverse, linguistically diverse area or continent. There are more than 350 different languages across the continent and over 1,000 named varieties, so 1,000 sort of ways of speaking with named varieties of language across the continent. And we always end up having to give these two numbers like this when we talk about Australian languages, because there's a big difference between a linguist definition of language and an Indigenous definition of language. So from an Indigenous perspective, every different way of speaking has its own name and is associated with a community of people and a particular area of the country, as you can see from this map that sort of stylizes all the language areas in a very pretty way. So from an Indigenous perspective, those 1,000 different ways of speaking that's 1,000 different languages. Linguists want to get more precise about this and try to work out which of these might be dialects of the same language and which of these we might consider to be distinct languages based on mutual intelligibility and lexicostatistics and so on. And so when we do that more linguistic, strict sort of analysis, we still end up with about 350. Some people in a recent paper, Claire Bowen has argued it's more like 440. So we still end up with a lot of different languages, even so, across the country. Now, of these, there has also been an awful lot of language loss. So there's only about 12 to 15 languages that are still being acquired by children as their first language. And there's maybe another 80 or so, although I'm sort of almost pulling that number out of the air. It's hard to know, but some more that are still spoken by elderly speakers in their communities, but not being learned by younger generations anymore. So those languages are really very close to not being spoken anymore. So there's been a lot of loss as a result of the very harsh effects of colonisation over the last 200, 250 years. There are a number of languages in the sort of southeast and southwest, particularly of Australia, where the communities are working very, very hard to revive languages, but without speakers anymore. Okay, so lots and lots of diversity. In terms of their relationships to each other, I think it's probably correct to say that the sort of working assumption that most Australianists have is that the languages are all related to each other at some point. But the actual details of this can be hard to determine. There's a recent book by Harvey and Mailhammer that's having a very good go at doing this. Part of the problem we have in Australia is that the written language, the languages are not traditionally written, and the time depth that we're talking about is conservatively about 65,000 years. So you can imagine the sort of change you can get over that period of time, and how difficult that can make this sort of historical work to sort of trace back relationships and the prehistory of languages and so on. But what we do know is that there are a number of subgroups, so the languages are related to each other according to around 25, 26 different subgroups of languages. Interestingly, there was one very big one, and it's the whole area that's white on this map here, is one single subgroup, has been well established as a single subgroup that we call Pama-Nyungan. So Pama being the word for person up here in the northeast in Cape York, and Nyunga being the person, the word for person down here in the southwest. And this whole stretch of the continent, which is 5/6 of the continent, including a couple of little patches up here as well, are all covered with languages that can be related as part of this Pama-Nyungan subgroup. And then up in the north here, or what we call the top end, we have a whole lot more diversity, about 24 other smaller groupings of languages. We haven't quite got all the work in place to show higher order relationships here. But we call this group of language, all of these languages up in the north, collectively are called non-Pama-Nyungan. And that's not actually a subgroup itself. That just means they're a collection of language families that are not Pama-Nyungan. We don't quite know how they're related to each other yet in terms of the detail. And these two sort of groups, the Pama-Nyungan and the non-Pama-Nyungan languages, are very different typologically and grammatically. So the Pama-Nyungan languages, this big, huge family of hundreds of languages, they are heavily dependent marking, lots and lots of case marking, complex case marking, word order flexibility, a bit, I guess, a bit Latin-like, I suppose, in many respects. And then up in the north here, the non-Pama-Nyungan languages are very complex verbal morphology. So head marking languages, lots of verbal agreement with subjects and objects and oblique markers and incorporated nouns and incorporated adverbial elements and so on. So we've got these really different typological categories across Australia in terms of these groupings. So Murrinhpatha is one of these non-Pama-Nyungan languages. It's spoken by 2,500 to 3,000 people in and around a community called Wadeye in the Northern Territory. You can see on the map here where Wadeye is and where Murrinhpatha is spoken. 2,500 to 3,000 people, I'm sure for most of you doesn't really sound like very many, but in the Australian context, that's huge. It's one of the biggest languages in terms of numbers of speakers in Australia. And it's probably a lot bigger now in terms of numbers than it was before colonisation. It's used for daily communication across the community. Everyone in the community uses it. It's everyone's first language. They use it all the time, except for when they have to speak to non-Indigenous people. And what is quite a remote community, you can see on this map, this really is sort of the roads that exist in this part of Australia. So there's this one road that comes in. There's not really many other towns or communities on it, just a couple of little ones. And then the road stops when you get to Wadeye. So there's not really any reason to go to Wadeye unless you're going to Wadeye, if you see what I mean. So it's quite remote in that respect. And the roads get cut off by rains for about 4 or 5 months of the year. This is a tropical part of the world. But it is one of a small number of Australian languages that's still being acquired as a first language by all children in the community. And I've been working there since about 2005. So I have got to know many people rather well, which enabled the project I'll be telling you about. Okay, so I said Murrinhpatha is a polysynthetic language, and what I mean by this is that a single verb can morphologically encode what would be a full sentence in a language like English. So with a single verb, you can express all of the arguments of that predicate as well as other information like adverbial elements and whatever else you might want to express. And here's an example. And if you can't hear this, just yell out. I can't see any of you, but just yell out if you can't hear it. But I think hopefully you will be able to. Don't worry about the grammatical stuff down here. That it's not necessary to understand the point I'm trying to make. It's just there if there are any grammar nerds like me who are wondering what on earth is going on in this big verb. But let's listen to Carmelita saying it. I'll play it again. All right, so that's a single verb that expresses that full English sentence there. Oh, sorry. And here's another one. Again, another complex verb. So a lot of Murrinhpatha speech is layered with these very, very complex verbs. The verbal template, this is the verbal template that builds these verbs. And the details of this whole template don't really matter for our purposes today, except for a few things I'm about to point out to you. So what's important is that the large majority of Murrinhpatha verbs are actually complex predicates. So the verb itself, the predicate, the bit that gives you the whole meaning of the verb, is made up of two parts. The classifier stem, which is here in the first slot of the template, CS for classifier stem, and the lexical stem, which is here in the fifth slot of the verbal template. And other bits can come in between these, or if you don't need any of those bits in your verb, these two predicate elements will be next to each other. So it just depends on what else is going on. The predicative elements together give you the verbal meaning, and you need to get the right combination to make sure you're conveying the meaning you want to convey. So in this big verb we just heard earlier, the bena here at the beginning is the classifier stem, and the ngalep in the middle here is the lexical stem, and they are together giving you the meaning of sort of sneakily watching under the arm, which is what this person was doing in the story that I was being told. The other things to notice are that the same information pops up in multiple parts of the verb. So we get subject information here in the first slot and here again in the second slot. We can get it here in the 8th slot. We've got tense aspect mood marking here in the first slot, again in this slot 6, and so on. So there's a lot of dependencies through the verb that are encoding the same information in different ways. And so you need to sort of get those bits right to get a grammatical verb as well. All right, so as I said, the most of the verbs in Murrinhpatha are complex verbs made up of these two parts, a classifier stem, which you'll see in these examples in blue, and a lexical stem in orange. And there are 38 paradigms of these classifier stems. So these classifier stems encode subject, person, and number, as well as tense and aspect and mood, and event classifying semantics, like sort of broad classificatory event semantics. And we'll see some examples in a moment. So 38 paradigms of these, only 11 of them ever occur as verbs on their own. So the large majority of these classifier paradigms only ever occur in combination with one or more lexical stems. And the lexical stems can never occur alone either. So they're a closed class. There's about 1,500 of them, I think, in our dictionary. But they never occur on their own. They only ever occur in combination with a classifier stem. You get some partial productivity through the system, but many of the combinations are actually lexicalized and not really semantically transparent. So we can already begin to see what sort of a challenge learning a language like this might be for the child. Well, I certainly know how much of a challenge it is to learn a language like this. And, children are doing it much better than me. All right, so here's some examples just to show you how this system works. So here I've taken one lexical stem, wanda, which might mean something like sort of split open, like imagine a coconut or something that we're splitting open. And if I put it with the ba, which is from the paradigm that describes, I gloss it as bash, but it sort of describes actions that are done with an instrument sort of applied in a heavy downwards motion like this, right? That's the sort of event classifying semantics it has. So if I say bawandano, that is going to describe like I split something open, maybe with an axe or something, sort of bawandano, like that. Whereas if I change the classifier stem and I use, say, this classifier paradigm, which is used for events that are done with the end of a pointed instrument. So if I say ngawandano, I ask someone, what does this mean? Ngawandano. People will say, oh, it's like if maybe you're shooting at that coconut, and when you shoot at it, it splits open, right? So you're splitting something open by shooting at it or by poking at it, stabbing at it. Buwandano, it gives us a different verb where we're splitting it open by hitting it down hard on something. Nguandano means splitting it open with the long edge of an instrument, like maybe a knife or a stick or something. So you can see that by varying the classifier stem here and holding the lexical stem constant, we're still getting a lot of different predicate meanings through the combination. And then we can do it the other way around, where we hold the classifier stem constant and we change the lexical stem, and we can see, again, a variation in the predicate meanings. So here, bangam is the classifier stem meaning sort of bashing in some way. If we say bangandal, that's like chopping something like with an axe. If I say, well, bangambranda we saw before, if I say bangamelmel, melmel means to sort of flatten something. So that means I'm bashing down on something to flatten it. Bangamlet, well, it's like if I'm sticking one thing on top of another. So all these are different events, but they're being described through a combination of the right classifier stem with the right lexical stem. So this gives you a sense of the most productive parts of the system, but actually a lot of the combinations are not as transparent as this. So here's an example. Here the lexical stem is bite, and the classifier stem here is the sort of do something with your hands. So nanji manabaitno. So manabaitno means I'll take it to him. I'll take it to him. Right. So here you might say, okay, well, do with the hands. That makes sense. Bite might mean something like take. But then we get other forms like bebaitno, which is a different classifier stem. And here the whole verb means to cook. It will cook. So it's hard to see how bite could mean take here in this particular combination. And then we find this same bite being used with a different classifier stem to mean drown, a fourth classifier stem, number 28. Sometimes we number them because we don't know what they mean. And here it means watch. And so you can see that in these combinations, they're really not semantically transparent. They're just lexicalized combinations of forms. You just need to learn that if you want to express the meaning of drown, you need to put bite with something from that particular paradigm, and that gives you drown. But you can't really build it up compositionally from the individual elements. So classifier stems, as I've said, encode subject information, tense, aspect, mood. Here's an example of a single classifier paradigm. So this is just one. You can see there are 6 different tense or mood categories across the top here. And down the side, we've got 4 different number categories. So singular, dual, and plural, and then a separate first inclusive category, which means, you and me, as opposed to me with someone else. So, complex already as a paradigm. When we look at the forms here, you can see some sort of partial patterns, but nothing quite as perfect as you might like. So in the singular forms here, we can see that first person tends to have a velar initial eng, second person has the, third person has k, except in the future where it has p. But then now in the dual, second person is n initial. So there's some sort of patterns, but they're just a bit partially productive. You can't really rely on them. Number is distinguished here in the past imperfective, just in the dual forms. For example, actually in all of these forms here, you get at the end of the dual forms versus e in the singular plural forms. So there's certain patterns, but as soon as we switch to a different paradigm, those patterns change. So here's a different paradigm. This is the do with hands. Now we can see we don't have eng initial forms in the singular, actually. We don't have k or p initial forms in the third singular. The vowel alternations are different in different parts of the paradigm. So each paradigm has its own sort of semi-partial patterns, but they don't really easily transfer across each of these paradigms. And remember, there are 38 of these. So the learning task for the child is very, very complex. Not only do they have to learn that complex verb template and get all the bits of the verb in the right place, they also have to learn the correct combination of the classifier stem and the lexical stem so that they get the meaning, they can express the meaning they're trying to express, and they need to select the correct form of the classifier stem from one of these huge partially suppletive paradigms. There's not really a set of sort of abstract rules that they can easily just learn to help them do this. So how do they do it? Well, this is what we've been looking at in our language acquisition in Murrinhpatha project, known as LAMP, which myself and a number of colleagues have been working on for a few years. Here are some of the children who have helped us with this research, and some of these children are now teenagers themselves. And here are my colleagues that I have worked with so far on this project. And some of the questions that we have been interested in addressing are questions like, how is this complex verbal morphology acquired? And this relates to the sort of bigger question of, do children acquire all languages in the same way? Is there just a sort of single way in which humans learn language, or does the grammatical structure of the language that you're learning affect the process you go through in order to learn it? This project started in 2013. We're still chipping away at it. We've got a lot of data. We haven't answered everything, so we're sort of working away. And I want to particularly acknowledge Bill Forshaw and Lucy Davidson here, who were PhD students on the project initially, gathered a lot of the data early on, and have continued now, post PhD, to work with me on various aspects of it. But a big part of the data collection and research is due to their PhD work. Okay, so what we did is, overall, putting it all together, we've got a sort of longitudinal study of about 13 different children, aged at the start between sort of 2 and 4, and then we recorded them over 2 years so that we end up with children being about between 4 to 6 or so at the end of the 2 years. So we get a bit of a span from 2-year-olds to 6-year-olds in terms of language use. When we first started to do this project, we initially sort of approached the data collection along the lines of how acquisition work is sort of generally done in the field, by bringing a child and their caregiver into a space, with toys and activities and things to constrain the context and the speech that they would be using, and just ask them to interact so we could record it. This turned out to be an absolute disaster because it's not really the way in this culture adults and children hang out. So the situation was unfamiliar. Kids and parents don't really sit and play with toys in a sort of one-on-one situation like that very much. And so most of the recordings we got were just parents or caregivers saying the equivalent of, say something, she wants you to speak. And then the children sort of throwing the toys around, and it didn't really work. We very quickly worked out that it was much better to take families out bush in bigger groups, have children and adults interacting in a much more free-form way, and we got much more naturalistic data that way. What we did was we would take we would have a couple of target children at a time, the ones we were actually recording. Sometimes there were other children as well and adults. And we would go out and we'd go to the bush for the day. We'd make cups of tea and go fishing and so on. And the target children would be wearing backpacks. You can see in this photo the little red backpacks on these two kids. There would be a recorder in the backpack and a little microphone clipped to the front. And we'd film them with a couple of video cameras as well and just allow them to move freely around. So I'll give you a little snippet of what this looks like. So we can hear the adult through the microphone. You can see Joe here setting up one still camera, and I think it was Bill walking towards them with the other camera. You can hear, as well as the microphones could pick up not just the children's voices, but also any adults in the vicinity. So we got the input that way as well. Initially, we were worried that the children would resist the wearing the backpacks. They wouldn't like to wear the backpacks. As it turned out, the backpacks were incredibly popular and the kids loved the backpacks, so much so that they would fight over the backpacks, and we had to end up creating placebo backpacks for the non-target kids to wear just while we just had recorders in a couple of kids, but we had backpacks for other kids to wear as well. So they ended up being very popular. Okay, so what did we find? Well, the first thing we found is that big verbs are hard. So this is one of my favorite examples. You may have heard me play this before. This is an interaction between an adult and the child. The child is 3 here, so just over 3. And there's a few notable things in this interaction. Firstly, the adult just uses this big, long, complex verb and doesn't slow it down. They don't simplify it. In general, we found adults didn't simplify verbs at all in their speech to children. It just came, the full complexity. And the other thing you notice in this interaction is that the adult gives this big, long verb and then says tama at the end. And tama means you do it. So this is a very common language socialization strategy that adults do, where they sort of prompt children, like give a big verb and then say you do it, and then ask the child to repeat it. They don't just do it to children, they do it to me as well. And let me play the example first. I'll play it again. So you can see how effective this strategy is for Emily. And I have to say, I do just about as well as her when people do this to me. So the point is that big verbs are hard, right? Kids, they are hard to learn, and kids, there's no sort of miracle where kids suddenly can just produce these big, long, complex verbs. However, we did find that children have acquired quite substantial morphological complexity well before 3 years old. So here's an example of one child, Acacia, who we're calling Acacia, at just over 2.5. No. So this is really quite a complex verb already. She's got the classifier stem, she's got the lexical stem, so na and kut. She's got the right combination, she's got the right form of the classifier stem, she's got an incorporated object, oblique marker here, she's got a future tense marker on the end, she's got the right future tense form of the classifier stem to agree with the future at the end. So there's a lot of complexity here already at 2.5. Here's another one from Nathan at 3.5, just over 3.5. So again, he's got the right classifier stem, the right lexical stem. He's got a serial verb here at the end that is another classifier stem that has to agree with the main one in terms of its tense and subject and so on, and he's got all that correct. He's got an incorporated object marker. So a lot of complexity here in terms of the morphological structure, and especially so when you consider that, so this is 3.5 and the previous one was 2.5. When you consider that English acquiring children are still overgeneralizing our very simple verb morphology and saying things like brind and goad at up to 4 or 5 years old, so where English acquiring children are still struggling with that, here we have much younger children doing many more complex morphological things, which is interesting. We do, of course, find errors. A lot of the errors are phonological, so bits of the verb being dropped off or mispronounced. And here's an example from Acacia again at 2.5. So she says laleno when the adult form would be baleleno. So instead of baleleno, she's sort of reduced the initial couple of syllables to laleno. So we definitely find a lot of these sorts of phonological errors. But surprisingly, we don't find any errors of morphological structure or clear overgeneralization. So we don't get bits of the verb in the wrong place or overgeneralizing a single part of the verb to a whole lot of other verbs where it wouldn't be grammatical. So we find a surprising amount of complexity even at quite an early age amongst the children, and the children basically get it right. Even in terms of the complex predicate formation, we get the right classifier stem with the right lexical stem. We don't find any clear examples of getting those combinations wrong, which really surprised me, actually. I expected that what we would find, given the complexity of the system, that children might choose one or two of those paradigms and just use them everywhere in wrong combinations until they worked it out. But we didn't find any of that at all. The verbs they produce are essentially grammatically correct. So what this suggests is that children are learning these verbs as whole forms early on. So they're just learning the full grammatically correct form. And then over time, they use these sort of low-level processes of analogy to generate the new forms and expand their paradigm, their verbal paradigms. So they first learn a small number of inflected verb forms that just encode a few categories. I'll show you this in a moment. They're constructing these sort of little mini paradigms. And then as they progress, as they develop, they add more and more categories into their verbs. And this is what Bill Forshaw particularly focused on in his PhD. He was looking at the acquisition of classifier stems, and he found a very clear developmental sequence that really shows this point, that children begin with a subset of the classifier paradigm, and then they expand that incrementally as they get older. And that the order of acquisition is influenced by how children use verbs. There's a sort of self-interest bias that's been talked about in the literature for English acquiring children and all children of learning a range of languages, where children start out by using verbs that express the things they want to they're most interested in talking about. So particularly that's their own actions. So you get a lot of first singular verbs, future tense, like I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. And also requesting action from others. So you get second singular imperatives like do this for me, give me that, and so on. And this is exactly what we find in these Murrinhpatha children. So they start with first and second singular categories in the subject of the classifier stem. And they start with future tense, which is also used for imperatives in Murrinhpatha, and sort of existential, which is used for, pointing out what's happening around in the here and now. So this is from Bill's thesis. Oh, that's just reminding you what the paradigm looks like. So the paradigms are this big, but what we're going to find is that the children initially are just using first and second singular forms and future forms, so just this little tiny top part of the paradigm, and then they slowly start to build it as the acquisition develops. So here's from Bill's thesis. This is looking at the subject categories encoded in the classifier stem. You can see that at the very youngest ages, there's not many verbs here at all, but the ones that there are either first singular or second singular, that's it. Then as kids get a bit older, they bring in third singular category. Then as they get older again, we start to see some first inclusives. And then it's not until we get around 5.5, that we start to see the full range of number and person in their verbs. So it's really incrementally developing over time. And similarly with the classifier stems, the tense aspect mood, sorry. So you've got future initially and existential early on. Then over time, we bring in the non-future forms and then the imperfective forms. And so by around 5, we've got the full range of the tense categories. So children are really homing in on the small parts of these complex paradigms to begin with, driven by the types of things they want to talk about. And then they use these pathbreaker categories to get into the system and progressively expand from there. We found something very similar in recent work where we were looking at the development of object and oblique marking in the corpus, and we used a sort of subset of the corpus for this study. And by reminder, in terms of the template, we're talking about the second slot here now. So in the second slot of the template, you get object or oblique marking encoded. And crucially, this is in between the classifier stem and the lexical stem. So this is an important slot because it shows it when it's filled, it shows the children that the classifier stem and the lexical stem are separate elements. So we had a look at the number of object and oblique markers in this subset of the corpus that we looked at. As you can see, there weren't that many, but what we found were only singular. So there was only 2 object markers, both second singular. There were a few more oblique markers, but again, only singular. Note that there are no third singular object markers in Murrinhpatha. So there were lots of transitive verbs being used, but if they had a third singular object, there wasn't a marker there. So that's why we might have expected more of those if the language had them. But what's interesting here are these obliques. Now, this second singular oblique here, the 24 instances, that looks sort of like it could be interesting, but it's really not, because all 24 instances were uttered by the same child in a single recording when she was just, being a 3-year-old and saying the same thing over and over and over and over and over and over again 24 times. So this mambano is the verb that she says, where she's basically saying, I'll do it for you, I'll do it for you, I'll do it for you. So I'll play you just to get you a sense of that. 24 times. So, made the transcription task easy, but doesn't really tell us a lot about the development of that marker. But what we're going to look at is this first singular oblique marker, because it's really striking how many of those there are, given how few there is of anything else, or how little there is of anything else. So we found that this was initially used at just over 3 by both of the, remember this is a subset of the corpus, so we just looked at 2 children over 5 time periods. So both children used it at around just over 3, and then used it in a variety of contexts. So it very quickly was quite productive. And when you look at the translations, you can see that it's largely used when a child is requesting that someone do something for them, right? So do it for me, get it for me, open it for me, hold it for me, and so on. The other thing you notice in this list here is that the classifier stem is almost always na. It's the same form. So let's just have a little look at na. Na is the second singular future, which is for imperatives as well, remember, for the do with hands paradigm. And it's turns out to be very common in the children's verbs, early verbs. It's used in a variety of contexts without nga as well, so without the first oblique marker. So we get lots of things like naat, so get it, or nawata, make it, nabai, take it, nayit, hold it, and so on. So lots of these examples in the corpus as well. And we find that there's, some of these forms, some of these verbs are found both with and without nga. So we get nayit, but then we also get nangayit, right? So nayit, hold it, or nangayit, hold it for me. And what we propose is that nga is the sort of pathbreaker form here in the oblique marking. It provides further evidence for children of these contrastive examples, which help them to uncover the structure of Murrinhpatha verbs, because this goes in second position, this nga. It teaches children the distinction that the classifier stem is distinct from the lexical stem. And so it gives them a sort of simple contrastive pathway into this verbal complexity. So they sort of start with the first singular oblique. Through that, they learn about the structure of the verbs or that part of the structure of the verbs, and then they can progressively start to build more verbs and combine and come up with more combinations from there. Okay, so overall, what we're finding is that children produce complex adult-like verbs from a very young age. They're able to learn really quite a lot of morphological complexity very early, especially when we compare it to English acquiring children and children learning other sorts of languages. We find no errors in the templatic ordering, no mistakes in morphological categories, so they don't get the number marking wrong, they don't get the tense marking wrong. We don't find any overgeneralization of classifier stems and few to no ungrammatical combinations. I think we've come across one in our whole corpus where there's an ungrammatical combination of classifier stem and lexical stem. And what this suggests is that children learn inflected verbs as whole word forms early on, and then slowly, progressively, over time, use these processes of analogy in acquiring the new forms. They do this by starting with a small restricted set of categories and forms, so particularly first and second singular future forms, which are used for imperatives, third singular existential forms, which are sort of locating people and objects around them. And the categories they use increase with age. So by around 4 years, 11 months, around 5, we see non-singular subject numbers start to come in. We see the full range of tense, aspect, mood distinctions progressively come in, so on. So this shows us that children initially build these mini paradigms and then they slowly expand through the acquisition process. We found a similar process to this sees singular object oblique markers acquired first, particularly led by the first singular oblique marker nga, which seems to break in help break up the bipartite predicate in a way that gives children a pathway into the complex verbal structure. And this quote here is just from Bill's thesis, where he argues that the sort of contrastive use of this morphology emerges through the juxtaposition of whole combinations and not through the association of meaning with individual stem elements. So we don't find evidence that kids are learning meanings of individual morphs and then sort of constructing them online in that way. He says this illustrates that the characteristics of the system being acquired greatly impact how it is acquired. And in this instance, the system isn't regular or transparent enough for children to do this compositionally at the stages he was looking at in his study. So zooming out into sort of acquiring polysynthesis more broadly, our findings support the idea that the typological properties of the language being learned affect the process of acquisition. So learning morphology in a polysynthetic language proceeds differently to learning morphology in a language like English. Right? The role of morphology is very different in a polysynthetic language. And so children need to adapt their learning to learn that morphology a lot earlier than they need to do it in English. So children adapt their learning to suit the language being learned. If morphological complexity is important in the language, it'll be acquired early. So this shows us that language learning is not a single process. Like different structures need to be learned in different ways, and emphasizes, I think, the importance of really embracing the full range of linguistic diversity and incorporating it into our theories of language while we still have the chance. So thank you very much. I do have a number of reference slides just to show you I've done my due diligence, but I'll leave the thank yous up instead. So thank you.